Thank you, Rachel. I think this is a great segue from that most excellent keynote that we all just heard. Uh, I'm going to lead us off today in a panel that is going to dwell on the larger issue of large language models and caregiver support. There's a question in the chat bot in the Q&A box about clinical use cases for AI chatbots in mental health, and perhaps we end up making the case for why caregiver support is a good one. So our panelists today, other than myself, are Joe Chung, Rachel Sava, and Benji Silverman. Um, I'll get us off talking about a specific project, and we're all going to be essentially discussing one very specific study that we've just completed. This is also the world premiere of the study findings. We finished the analyses quite recently, and we were excited to present these data at TIPS before we move towards publication. So, quick look at my disclosures. No significant conflict here. But I am obligated by our IRB and Office of Interactions with Industry to declare that Mass General Brigham, who own McLean Hospital, have financial interest in Rippl Care, whose technology we used for the study. And this interest was reviewed and managed in accordance with the conflict policies of Mass General Brigham. Uh, so let's talk dementia and let's talk caregiving. And before we get into tech, let's make a case for why this is an issue that is not only ripe for digital innovation in just about any form, but why digital innovation is actually essential here. So we know some of this. The dementia currently affects about 5.5 million people in the United States and 18 to 20 million people worldwide. This number is going to almost triple over the next 25 years. It's projected to increase to 13.8 million. But the real story of dementia is not going to play out in this part of the world. In Asia, the prevalence of dementia is expected to increase tenfold or more, right? So consider that against the background of how much it actually costs to take care of dementia. The annual costs in the US are believed to be about $304 billion. And then there is the caregiving aspect of it. So the Alzheimer's Association estimates that in the last year, about 18 billion hours of unpaid care were provided by about 15 million family members. So about three caregivers per person with dementia. And this was modeled to be worth about 244 billion, right? So we're in the ballpark of $600 billion of overall cost of dementia care. Now, for context, uh, McDonald's as a corporation makes about $30 billion a year. So simple math. Dementia care would be enough to bankrupt McDonald's 20 times over uh, every year. So to the extent that you define the public health importance of anything by how much it costs to take care of it, dementia is the biggest public health issue in the United States, and it's not close. Consider also this, though, that two-thirds of all caregivers are women. One-third of them also care for another family member, like a child. And so that means that there's about 10 million women in America involved in caregiving across the board. So this is not just an issue of neuroscience or mental health or geriatric mental health. It's also an issue of women's mental health. And what has become amply clear is that the gaps between the need, availability, and accessibility of resources for caregivers, it widens quite literally every day, and the existing approaches are not likely to solve this. So we need something. We need something to fill these giant gaps, some sort of resource that can provide caregivers whatever support they need. And that's the other conundrum, that the support is so individualized. So with all of this in perspective, and in 2023, with ChatGPT starting to explode all around us, our team asked some questions, and these are questions from the before times, uh, which was that could these new tools like ChatGPT be used by caregivers of people with dementia, and if they use them, would they work? And if they work, what aspects of caregiver support would they actually be good at? Could they provide emotional support? Could they provide factual information? Could they support decision making? And there's the question of how would they compare to a human care manager? But then we also asked that if these could be used by caregivers, could they also be leveraged by care managers themselves? And should clinicians consider recommending these tools as a part of care? And this was a radical idea, wasn't it, in 2023? The idea that a clinician told a patient to talk to an AI chatbot for a quick and simple answer when they wanted it. But we figured people are going to do this, so we might as well see how we can support the process rather than question it. And so our team asked whether we can help clinicians figure out what to emphasize and what to caution patients and families about. And then there's the most important question of all, which is if we did this study and we showed that these tools work, would families actually want to use them? So with that in mind, we applied for a pilot grant it's funding through the National Institutes of Aging, but they support the A2 Collective, which is a dementia and AI collaboratory. And one of the sites in that collaboratory is the Massachusetts AI and Technology Center, who gave us pilot funding to conduct this study. The study is called the Caring for Alzheimer's Disease with AI and Large Language Model Study, or the CARE-ALL study. And what we're going to present today is the design and the findings from the CARE-ALL study. So the study had a couple of straightforward goals. These goals were inspired by a sharp understanding by our clinical team of what is needed in the real world. So we wanted to compare and we wanted to develop. We wanted to compare how a large language model specifically trained on talking to caregivers compares to an experienced geriatric care manager in response to caregiver queries. So we thought we would start with best case scenarios, a bot that had been trained on caregiver data, and Joe Chung will discuss this, and the geriatric care manager at McLean in the geriatric psychiatry outpatient services with extensive experience. Uh, and we wanted to know if not just a human versus AI work, but whether a human working with an AI is actually more effective than both together, than either independently. And in addition to that, we proposed developing an ethics framework around how to discuss LLM use by caregivers and for people with dementia. And we also wanted to develop some best practices for clinicians and caregivers about how to do this right. And this was based on some fundamental assumptions and strategic principles that we wanted this project to not be an elegant clinical trial, but we wanted it to be messy and we wanted it to reflect clinical reality to the extent possible. We decided very early on that we were not going to focus on building a bot. We were going to partner with someone that already had a bot built. We were also not interested in whether someone should use an LLM, but how, with the assumption that that has borne true over the next 2 years that everyone's going to use these tools. And it's going to be hard to put that genie back in the bottle. And we wanted to create products, not just data. So we wanted to make sure we came up with some guidelines. And in the end, the point of this project was to be useful in the real world, not just to test a hypothesis. So this is the overall outline of the study that we were going to start with caregivers. We were going to recruit a sample of 25 caregivers. And then there were three components. We were going to rank caregiver support via LLM. We were going to do a modified Delphi method for generating ethics guidelines, and then one-on-one interviews to develop best practices. So for arm one, we generated 75 questions to be asked, and these were done through focus groups with our caregivers. And the same set of questions was posed to the LLM, to the geriatric care manager, and then it was posed to the geriatric care manager who would be aided by the LLM. And we did a survey of the caregivers then to compare the responses. So the people who asked the questions effectively would decide which of the answers was the most helpful. For the Delphi method that Benji Silverman will discuss in detail, we polled a large number of stakeholders over focus groups and questionnaires through 2 rounds and developed the ethics framework. And then finally, with some of the same caregivers, we did structured one-on-one bioethics interviews around informed consent and LLM use. And the qualitative analysis will help develop best practices. With that, I'm going to pause and I'm going to hand over the microphone to Joe Chung to talk about the specific large language model that we used. Joe?
Great. Thank you, Ipsit. Let me share my screen here. So I hope we can all see that. So I just wanted to briefly cover the considerations that anyone would have to go through in in setting up an LLM for this use case, or really pretty much any healthcare use case. So just briefly, I just stepped down as CTO and head of AI at Rippl Care, who partnered on the grant with IPSIT. And I was previously I got to Rippl because I co-founded and was CEO of a company called Kinto, which was a dementia caregiver support app, which IPSIT was an advisor of and helped us out a lot in the early days. I was PI on an NIH-funded 300-person efficacy trial. And we were also a previous Mass AITC pilot grant recipient on AI for discovering caregiver resources for dementia. So I'm going to cover three basic topics. Hipaa compliance, which unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your perspective, drives a lot of your technology strategy when you're doing this kind of work. Then I'm going to talk about how one enhances the base models like ChatGPT or the other frontier lab models that are out there, and then briefly touch on safety and bias, which is always going to be a major concern as well as it should be. So first of all, talking about HIPAA for a moment, HIPAA basically drives you to having two options. You can either run your own model, which is almost going to certainly be a public domain open weight model. The best ones are coming out of China right now for this world from DeepSeek, but there's a lot to choose from, and you can set up your own infrastructure and run it yourself. It's a lot of work and not really recommended unless there's a really strong reason to do so. The other option is use a commercial model such as OpenAI's or Google Gemini or a number of the other ones that are out there that are good and available, and then execute a quote unquote business associate agreement. Um, and then you have a lot of security and data management requirements. There's just a kind of a tax you have to pay to stay compliant with the regulations, and it's a bit unavoidable. It's not that hard. It's not that easy either. And one of the fun facts is that. I read some survey that said some majority or really strong percentage of clinicians are using ChatGPT to consult with patient data and get second opinions. That's like totally not allowed. Just so you know, ChatGPT the actual ChatGPT UI is not actually covered under OpenAI's BAA, which would allow you to put PHI through a system like that. What is covered is their backend APIs that allow you to use those models, but only programmatically, only through software that you've written yourself. So just an FYI. So at Rippl, we went with the commercial model and with the BAA with OpenAI, and we built the model that we provided to IPSIT study was done using that using OpenAI's GPT-4. And then that comes to enhancing a large language model. And I think the basic way of putting it is that your off-the-shelf model it's all things to all people. But for our purposes, we want a true expert. We want a specialist at a very specific task that will perform that task well and reliably and predictably. So, and the kind of the I think the framework of thinking about it is that these frontier models just have an outrageous amount of knowledge and expertise. They kind of know like everything. They read every doctoral dissertation. They read every textbook. They know about behavioral health. They know about Alzheimer's disease. They know everything about caregiving for Alzheimer's. But all that information is like sort of like buried in the model in its billions or trillions of parameters down there, and you kind of have to coax it out to get maximum performance. And there are two primary techniques for doing that: so-called prompt engineering, sometimes now called context engineering, and fine tuning. And I'll just briefly for the we actually did a little bit of experimentation with this with IPSIT and Rachel to just kind of compare the two. So I'll just go briefly into that. Um, on the prompt engineering side, this is kind of what you're probably familiar with. This is really about asking a good question. You're not going to get a good answer from or I should say, the better of a question you ask of a large language model, the better the answer you're going to get. And prompt engineering is really about constructing a schema so that you are reliably asking a very good question. And so a typical schema, and the one that we were using for this study, had these sort of four major areas or four major pieces. One is identifying the role that the large language model is playing here, and this sort of, you can think of it as kind of like prepping the model so that it's already thinking down the right paths. So we start with something like, you're an expert in dementia caregiver support. You're trained in the UCSF care ecosystem. Kate Posan, who created that in her wisdom, open sourced all of it. So all of that's out in the web, which means it's all in the training materials of every single large language model out there. If you go to any model and ask it to regurgitate pieces of care ecosystem training materials, you'll get it because it's been pre-trained on that. As well as the Alzheimer's Association has a lot of information out there about how to coach people, how to be a good care manager for Alzheimer's. So you kind of like set up the role so it's already thinking down the right lines. Then you give it specific instructions. In this case, it was answer the following question from a caregiver about dementia, dementia caregiving, et cetera. Rely on your professional training. And then you give examples. You instruct the model to specifically follow certain examples, both in format and style. And I'll get to style in a moment. And finally, you add some guardrails. An important one in this case would be just to decline to answer any questions that are unrelated. To try to detect that. And again, I'll come back to safety and soundness and bias in a moment on that. The other alternative to using prompt engineering, and in fact, these aren't really mutually exclusive. You can do both, but the more radical intervention here, so to speak, is to actually change the model itself through a process called fine tuning. And what we did in our kind of mini experiment here is we provided the model with 100 exemplar questions and answers that we derived synthetically out of a whole bunch of care consultation best practice training calls that I was given access to when I was partnering with the Alzheimer's Association, and we pulled those out. You need a lot to do this well. It's kind of the more you have, that's better. And what this process does is it remolds the model itself. It kind of remolds the core behavior of the model and focuses it, it readapts it to the specific task you're on. What it doesn't do, and what's not good, is adding brand new knowledge, because in some sense you kind of assume all the knowledge that you're adding, especially in this particular use case, is already in the model, and trying to force new knowledge in at this phase can often be counterproductive. So I think what we found there, and what you end up with, is that you sort of in the fine tuning model, you kind of like really shift the way that it's going to speak. So this is just a quick comparison. I'm not, not an eye test, but you can sort of see that in the fine tune model, when asked this particular question, when should I tell the truth and when should I lie about a dementia care situation, the fine tune model gives a very kind of brief conversational answer, which is exactly like the training materials that we gave it. We basically said, no matter what, answer in this style, and it really and it does that. And in this particular case, I think the answer is a pretty decent answer. It's not bad, but it's not very detailed. It's really more like a human response, and then you'd expect the conversation to continue. On the prompt engineering side, you get like a really typical ChatGPT kind of response. And you get the answer, and then you get, step one, step two, step three, you get the bullet points, that very ChatGPT style of thing. So to some extent, your choice here is governed by what you really want to, which you prefer. But I think the real issue is that fine tuning can have some really unanticipated and unexpected consequences, because it's really, effectively realigning the model itself. So you have overfitting problems where you actually reduce the model's ability to provide good answers if the question is not in kind of the original training set that you fine tune with. It absolutely will shift the style and voice in a way that you kind of can't force it out of anymore. And one of the bigger concerns is it may actually break the model safety and bias training. The prompt engineering route gives you much more the typical large language model personality, but it also affords the full capabilities of the original base model. So it's going to be more predictable, it's going to be more reliable, and honestly, it's just a lot less work. So I think that I would strongly advise anyone who's trying to do this kind of work to start in prompt engineering and really only think about doing something more radical like fine tuning if there's a real need for that. So lastly, I'll just close with a quick comment on safety and bias. what everyone needs to know is that any model can be jailbroken, which means that it's made to defy its own safety guardrails, just given enough effort by the attackers. And the AI world is locked in this Red Queen problem where you have to keep running as fast as you can to stay in the same place. The developers and attackers are every time someone figures out a way to defeat the attack, the attackers come up with a more clever and sophisticated way to defeat that, and it just keeps going on and on. Um, Multi-layer defenses are very highly effective. You have so you set it up so that you have a different LLM monitoring the original LLM, and then maybe even one monitoring the monitor. You get turtles all the way down, kind of thing. But it can be expensive and complicated. And but the thing I want to emphasize is that the real challenge in safety and bias is evaluation, is actually convincing yourself or gaining confidence that the performance is doing that the model is behaving the way you'd like it to behave. But I'll point that out that it's exactly the same problem as for humans. How do you know that your team of clinicians is doing a good job and not being biased and not giving people unsafe advice and all the rest of it? And the answer is you don't. You only do it by sampling and testing and doing all that kind of stuff. But I'll kind of close out with I believe the actual risk of harm in this particular domain is and always has been really low. A lot of the jailbreaks and people's examples of defeating, getting a ChatGPT to tell someone to do self harm or do something that's not right, is really for about generating headlines and clickbait and stuff like that. You have to work very hard to get the model to do so, and in normal course of legitimate use, a model just is really unlikely, if slash impossible. It just won't do that. So I think it's something. It's not to be ignored, but I think a lot of the concerns are a bit exaggerated here. And with that, I'll turn it over to back to Ifsit and Rachel, and yeah, certainly happy to take questions in chat or at the end.
Awesome. I'm gonna go next. Let me just share my slides. All right. Does that look good? Can everyone see it? All right. So hi everyone. My name is Rachel Sava. I'm the ITP program director, as you all know in the context of this conference, but I'm also an assistant neuroscientist at McLean Hospital. And Ipsit already kind of gave a brief summary of the portion of the project that I'm going to be talking about. But essentially, in this role, I was interested in learning more about how we could compare our geriatric care manager here on campus to that of the chatbot that Joseph just talked about. So, to give you a brief overview, we recruited 16 caregivers of persons with dementia for this project. Some of these folks were either spouses, children, grandchildren, or even paid caregivers of those with dementia. Our average age of these caregivers was around 50 years old, with a range of 22 to 83 years. And we're really excited about that range because it really gives us quite the range of lived experience. We had really young participants in there that were typically grandchildren or paid caregivers, and then we also had the older end, which tended to be spouses. And these folks had different experiences with the caregiving journey as well as with the use of tech. And in terms of some demographic data, just really briefly, just over half of our sampling here were white, 1/8 were Asian or Pacific Islander, and about a third were Black. We were just a little bit over 50% female, and in terms of ethnicity, 100% were not Hispanic or Latino. So we asked these 16 individuals to join us for 6 baseline focus groups that we held. And the goal here was to really try to understand their lived experience, their challenges, and their needs that they experienced throughout their caregiving journey. So we asked them to take us back to where it all started. What were sort of the things that they had to figure out right away that maybe were a challenge to figure out, that maybe they didn't have resources for? We asked them, what would you tell someone who's like new to this journey? And we really got some fabulous insights from these folks. Some of them are local here and are, patients with McLean, but many of these were from all over the country, some from really rural areas where they had limited access to resources. So we got a really great sampling there. And from those conversations, we developed over 100 common caregiver questions, as we called them, that we felt really encapsulated questions that might come up during this sort of these journeys. And we divided those 100 questions based on the theme that we thought that they represented. So we had factual questions, which are questions that could basically, have a single answer, right? Like, what tracking device can I use to protect my loved one? Maybe the answer is, an iWatch or whatever. Then we had questions that we considered were more problem solving, and that typically would maybe require a little bit more navigation and conversation. So examples of this is like, how do I get my care recipient to take their medication when they don't want to? Or how do I facilitate trust with my care recipient? And then finally, we had a subset that we considered to be emotional questions. And yes, emotional questions can be sort of factual and problem solving in their own way, but we put anything in there that had to do with sort of the emotional well-being of the caregiver themselves into this category. And while we say questions, some of these were actually just statements, and we wanted to see how the chatbot would respond to those. So, for instance, a question might be, my young children are frightened by my mother's sundowning symptoms, and this makes me sad, right? And we could then see what those answers would be. From there, we randomly took 25 from each category, so 25 factual, 25 problem solving, and 25 emotional questions, and then moved on to the next part of our study, where we asked the chatbot designed by Joe over at Rippl to answer these 75 questions. And then we also asked our geriatric care manager here at McLean to also answer those 75 questions. The answers to these we ended up being one shot. And so that's a little bit different than maybe what you've experienced with ChatGPT, where you would have maybe a back and forth conversation. For the purposes of this project, kind of as a pilot, we just restricted these to one shot. So we provided them a question and they were allowed to provide one answer. And so we asked them both to do that. And then finally, after our geriatric care manager had her chance to answer all of these questions, we then had her take a look at the large language model's response and craft a third response that was sort of a combo of the two. And just kind of some interesting stats and qualitative data from here. So the Rippl chatbot took 13 minutes to complete all 75 questions. And the format of those, kind of as Joe alluded to, were more like bullet points, a bit more instructional, action focused, and really easy to digest. And then our geriatric care manager here at McLean took about 6 weeks to complete these 75 questions. But mind you, she is like working full time. There's one of her here at McLean. She has so much workload. And so that's why it took a while. But she really put a ton of time into each question. It took her about 20 to 30 minutes per question because she truly wanted to think through what conversation she would have with her patient, because normally she would do this one-on-one, and she really wanted to encapsulate that in her response. And so as a result, these answers were a bit more narrative, as if you were talking to her. They included her opinions and insights and were more in a block paragraph style form. We then provided her the large language model and again, kind of give her free rein to come up with a third option. And this took about 2 weeks. So it was a bit quicker since she already had, an idea of what she was going to respond, but also had now this like large language model response right in front of her. And so basically what she told us that she did is she opted to take the large language model response and add her own insights to it. So from there, we now had 75 questions, each with 3 different responses. And we put these into REDCap to create a survey that we sent to our caregivers. Each caregiver was randomly assigned 15 questions, question and answer sets. And so how it would look in REDCap is the caregiver would see the common caregiver question, whatever that might be, and then they were provided randomly the 3 responses in a random order. So LLM wasn't always first and yada yada. But they were unlabeled. So technically the caregivers, well, maybe they could guess which one was which. They technically didn't know which was which. So they could read all 3 responses. And then we said, please rank the above responses from least helpful to most helpful. And then this is just an example of ranking them 1, 2, and 3. So they were not allowed to rank 2 responses as equal. They really had to choose which they found most helpful and least helpful. So we're still kind of early in a lot of these analyses, and I'm just going to give the highlights here for the purposes of this talk. All of these stats were conducted by Boyu Ren, who you'll be hearing from, I believe, either later today or tomorrow in another symposium. But what was really interesting was that overall, our participants consistently ranked the combined LLM plus GCM condition as most helpful. And so you can see that here, where 43% ranked that as their number one. And down here, you can see that that was statistically significant. Um, Also, the LLM also showed a modest but still significant advantage over the geriatric care manager in this case, which again, we can see here with these stats. We then thought it would be interesting to sort of break this down by themes. We had the emotional, factual, and problem solving, and we wanted to determine if those preferences might change depending on the question at hand. And it did actually. So in the emotional domain, the preferences were a bit more balanced between the three, and neither were statistically significant one over the other. So there was a bit more of a level playing field between the three. In contrast, when it came to factual questions, there was this very heavy preference toward the combination of the LLM plus GCM, with next preference for just LLM alone. So there really seemed to be more of like an LLM preference within the factual condition. And then problem solving was somewhere in between. So to kind of go over some key findings and kind of talk through some of our thoughts on this. So overall, the GCM plus LLM responses were preferred overall. Our take here is that maybe this hybrid approach was sort of the best of both worlds, that LLM provided a really clear, concise structure to the text, and the GM also added her own nuance and lived experience as well. Um, it's also our guess that the style differences likely shaped some of these preferences. Again, as we talked about, like the LLM was more bulleted and easy to digest, whereas the GCM was a bit more like long form. And so, part of it may have been having to do with readability and things like that. And that's not to say, um, uh, that one isn't better than the other necessarily, but we just thought that that was interesting, that maybe that was part of it. Um, Another interesting little part here is that when you compare the time it took to come up with these questions, to come up with the answers, the large language model generated responses 465,000 times faster than our GCM. Again, she has a full workload, and a lot of these questions really took a lot of time for her to consider. But there are like efficiency gains here. I don't think this project we're trying to say that a large language model is going to replace our geriatric care manager. Obviously, a lot of what she does is one-on-one or is conversational. Again, here was one shot, but the fact that maybe something like a large language model could be used alongside her or to answer some, single shot type questions that she might have is really appealing just from a time-saving purpose and helping folks get the care that they need. Also, again, as we talked about, question type mattered. So again, LLM generated content was favored the most for factual, but that favor fell for emotional questions. So again, it still did very well, but it just kind of goes to show that maybe some questions are more suited than others. An interesting tidbit that I didn't show stats on is that actually participants without previous LLM experience showed a higher preference for the GCM only responses. And so what I sort of take from that is if someone has never had ever interacted with a chatbot in their life, they probably live a lifestyle where that's not really important to them and that's not something that they're used to. So again, it might be the case where something like a typical like GCM response was a bit longer, in more narrative form might be preferred to someone who doesn't use tech a lot, right? Versus someone like you or I that maybe uses ChatGPT maybe a little bit too much, might really prefer some of those bullet points. And so again, these findings are preliminary. Excuse me. And we welcome your ideas during Q&A.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Ipsit, Rachel, and Joe. Can you see my slides okay? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so I am going to wrap up by talking a little bit about the ethics of some of this work. As Ipsit laid out, when we set out to do this work, one of our goals was to create a framework for how to think about ethical use of large language models by caregivers for persons with dementia. So you've seen this already, just to acknowledge our funding. And I really want to just give a special shout out to Ernest Yip, who was one of our co-investigators. He did the qualitative ethics interviews as part of his Masters in Bioethics capstone project that I mentored. And so very thankful for his efforts in helping with this work. So just to say, there are many ethical issues for the use of AI or LLMs in clinical research or in clinical care. This was a research study, so really did kind of come at it from the standpoint of clinical research. And this is not new for anyone here. I suspect at this point that the number of ethical issues raised by the use of AI and LLMs, thinking about things like consent and transparency and privacy and identifiability and data security and bias, et cetera, et cetera. So we started with that in mind, but then really wanted to try to make this as specific as possible for the population that we were studying. So we really focused on asking around what are the specific ethical issues related to the use of LLMs by caregivers for persons with dementia? And are they the same or are they different than the general ethical considerations that I just alluded to? Or are there specific, unique issues to caregivers or to caregivers for persons with dementia related to this ethics work? We started with that in mind, just to say there prior to this work was no framework for thinking about the ethics of AI and LLMs in this population. So we really tried to kind of cross some new territory here and really be specific in the aims that we were setting out for. We started to create this new ethical framework with several principles in mind. So we really wanted this to be as stakeholder informed as possible. And what I mean by that is that we wanted the caregivers to tell us about their experiences, about their concerns, about their thoughts, and really help us understand from their perspective what the ethical issues are, what the ethical guardrails should be. We wanted to be consensus driven. We wanted the approach to be empirical. And finally, we wanted it to be pragmatic. So much of the ethics work that I think goes on in tech in general, certainly AI ethics work, is a lot of talk and doesn't actually help you at the end of the day know what to do. And so we really wanted this to be as practical and pragmatic as possible. Our methods, as was discussed earlier, we basically did this through two different processes. We did a 3-round modified Delphi, and then we did individual scenario-based qualitative interviews with caregivers. So I'm going to run through, and just to say the stakeholders, the caregivers were first and foremost, but we did include clinicians, researchers, software engineers and developers, ethicists, IRB representatives, et cetera. So we had a diverse set of stakeholders. So our 3-round modified Delphi process, we started with a multidisciplinary panel of 22 stakeholders, the group that I just mentioned. In round 1, people were basically asked in an open-ended way to just tell us what they thought the ethical considerations were, again, specific to this population. That was followed up by an open-ended survey to basically say, did we miss anything? Was there anything maybe you didn't feel comfortable talking about in the group that you want to tell us about? Like, just give us, complete brain dump of all the possible ethical considerations you think we should be thinking about. And then in rounds 2 and 3, the participants anonymously rated the items for consideration in our ethical framework on a 5-point scale. And our data analysis set pre-specified thresholds for inclusion and exclusion from that framework. This was the scale that people used in terms of rating the importance of the item. We calculated means and medians, as well as the percentage of respondents who answered either very important or critically important, as well as people who said they didn't know, the percentage of people who didn't know. We excluded the didn't know answers from the mean or median calculations, but those were included when we calculated the percentage of respondents who answered in a specific way. So our pre-specified thresholds, we were including something in the framework if it was a median of greater than or equal to 4, and at least 70% said it was very or critically important. And we excluded from the framework if the median was less than or equal to 2, and less than half of the group rated it as very important or critically important. So what did we find? So there were 86 items that were raised after round 1. After after the second round, 35 items were rated for inclusion. And then after the third round, an additional 11 items reached consensus for inclusion. So there were 46 items in total that were included in our ethics considerations. The general topics are here. Again, probably not that new necessarily when you just think about AI tech ethics in general, but privacy, confidentiality, and data use, consent, transparency and explainability, bias and accessibility, accuracy, reliability, and human oversight. There was a lot on emotional and relational impacts. I do think that is unique to this population. Accountability and responsibility, longitudinal and societal considerations, and then there were some just kind of general ethical principles raised. So in round two, so this was kind of the first group of items that reached consensus. These were the top 10 items by mean. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to read through every single one of these for you, but you can see that the categories represented here: bias and accessibility, accountability and responsibility, some of our general ethics framework principles, and privacy and confidentiality and data use. People were interested in ensuring that the training data reflected a diverse caregiving experience, wanted to know about the developer responsibility for safe and ethical design, a lot of focus on regular monitoring and review by human experts. There was a lot of talk about need for human oversight, mitigating inaccurate or false information, and what the boundaries are between caregiving and clinical decision making. Those are some of the big things that we heard. We did ask in a final prioritization task to basically say, what are your three most important things? And so there were over 40% of the group rated these three items as their most important things. So mitigating the risk of inaccurate or false information, requiring some sort of regular review by human experts, and making clear boundaries between supportive advice and clinical decision-making or recommendations. Just to say a little about the qualitative interview process, we interviewed 16 caregivers of persons with dementia, including 2 who were professional caregivers. We did a baseline survey to collect some demographic information about previous experience using LLMs, and some baseline impressions about ethical considerations. And then we gave people scenarios. So we gave them a medication management scenario and a behavioral management scenario. In scenario 1, there was an AI system that was autonomously providing reminders and dispensing and adjusting doses and reporting adverse effects. And in scenario 2, there was an LLM that was providing suggestions for what to do if someone with dementia experienced agitation or anxiety, and provided de-escalation techniques such as verbal coaching or environmental adjustments. We asked people on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being complete trust and 10 being no trust, if they would trust a system as described. And then we asked the same question: if human intervention or oversight was added, how would that impact trust in the system? So the qualitative interview results were very concordant with the Delphi results. There was really a top concern for accuracy. There was an expression of more trust and desire for academic institutional backing. So we heard a lot of, well, we would be acceptable of this if McLean was doing this, essentially. And so we can talk more about what that might mean during the Q&A, but I think there was a desire for some sort of institutional backing or certification. There was very low trust in autonomous medication management, almost no trust at all, and very high trust in autonomous behavioral management, and actually complete trust when you added some human oversight to that. So what surprised us the most? I think there were a few things that were surprising that I want to highlight quickly. One is that caregivers expressed a preference for providing more data and giving more personal information and health information to the LLM in order to allow it to provide more accurate and personalized feedback. So we thought initially that people would be pretty concerned about privacy, because that is what we hear, when we think about AI tech ethics and LLMs. But what we heard repeatedly from the caregivers, and you can see here almost 80% endorse this, was that they were much less concerned about privacy, much more concerned about accuracy and usefulness of the responses, and much more willing to essentially provide that more information, prioritized over privacy concerns. In crisis situations, caregivers wanted the LLMs to directly contact emergency services or to actually connect with any healthcare provider. So even if your healthcare providers weren't available, over 90% said connect me with some healthcare provider. I think very interesting, there was very little concern about substituted judgment or surrogate consent. So in the Delphi process, essentially, I'm not going to read all of these because I'm running out of time here, but essentially, all of our items that asked about whether people with dementia should have to provide informed consent for sharing data or using data were excluded from the Delphi process. When we did our qualitative interviews, a majority of the caregivers were healthcare proxies. Almost none of them had actually talked with the person with dementia about AI or LLMs. That might be expected. Maybe that shifts in 5 or 10 years from now. And about half of the group thought that the person with dementia would want their data used for AI. What we heard from people was basically, when I go to my caregiving group and I talk to other group members about the person I'm caring for, I didn't ask permission to share that information with the group, and I don't think I need to ask permission to share this information with the LLM. Just to kind of wrap up here, we took all of this and tried to create an ethical framework. We're calling it the Care All Ethical Framework for LLM-assisted dementia caregiving. C for clinical boundaries and crisis pathways. A for accuracy and evidence. R for review, monitoring, and quality improvement. E for equity, bias, and accessibility. A for autonomy and consent. L for life cycle data protection and stewardship, and L for long-term impacts. This really tries to encapsulate the big picture issues that we got in our empirical findings. People want clear boundaries between what's supported caregiving advice and clinical decision making. They want escalation pathways. They want to make sure that everything has been put in place as possible to minimize inaccurate or false information. They do want some sort of routine review by human experts. Want to make sure that the training and validation data reflects diverse caregiving realities. I couldn't leave autonomy and consent out entirely, even though people really deprioritized it. I think there's still a need to respect the dignity and values of persons with dementia, and that authority should be clarified, and certainly assent should be sought and respected when possible. And then the pragmatic part. So how do we actually implement this in practice? I labeled these just so that the next slide makes sense. You can kind of go back and read these slides in more detail. But essentially, what this looks like in practice is we create a number of questions that people should ask themselves prior to launching the use of an LLM, either in clinical practice for caregivers with dementia or doing research. And so you can see here, for example, and these questions are, though categorized in different groups, are really not mutually exclusive. I think different groups of people could answer these different questions, but you can see here, essentially, if you go through these questions, things like what's the intended use versus out of scope use, what are the top 5 predictable hallucinations, what's the monitoring plan, have privacy limitations been explained, are there accountability structures across stakeholders, what's it meant to address, what's it not meant to address, how will you escalate to human care, et cetera, et cetera. I think if you go through and you answer these questions, that will hit upon all of the major ethical issues that we identified in our empirical survey, and I think really will help make sure that these technologies are used in a thoughtful, ethical way. So just to kind of wrap up, caregivers with persons with dementia are certainly interested in using LLMs to assist with dementia caregiving. They want LLMs to be accurate, useful, and to supplement rather than replace clinical care and decision making. And they do want it to have human oversight when necessary and or practicable. That's an interesting point we could certainly talk more about. What people said is basically we understand that human oversight would mean the whole thing is slower. And so there may be times where that would be useful and times where it would not be useful. The framework we've provided, the Care All Ethical Framework, is now the first ethical framework for the use of LLMs by caregivers with persons with dementia. We hope that it provides clinicians, investigators, developers, and IRBs with pragmatic advice and questions to ask themselves prior to implementing either clinically or in clinical research an LLM for dementia caregiving. And we hope that ultimately, at the end of the day, this provides some best practice guidelines that both promote innovation in dementia care, but also simultaneously protect the safety and dignity of persons with dementia and their caregivers. So I apologize, I went a little bit over, but I think we can transition into questions and still have a few minutes left. Thanks for everyone's attention.
Thank you, Benji. I'm going to see if I can pin all of our panelists. And we have a couple of questions in the Q&A box. Let's start with the first one. We'll go in order in which they were received. Joe, congratulations on what seems like an excellent LLM. Aside from how the LLM was used in the study, could you speak to how it was uh, used or any anecdotal feedback about how it was received in the clinical setting while you were at Rippl?
So we were using it experimentally to assist our own care managers, and the anecdotal responses were very similar to, I think, what Rachel presented. We found that it was really useful and helpful. We were not exposing it directly to dyads, but we felt that with more work and development, we certainly could and should in cases where that's useful. So I think we felt very comfortable about the technology at its base capabilities.
Thank you, Joe. Our next question is from Purvesh Dongre, who says he really appreciates the focus of this research on real-world deployment and the ethical framework. And the comment is that the outcomes can be used to derive guidelines for human AI interaction and collaboration for clinical use, similar to one by Amershi et al. Benji, can you talk a little bit about the extent to which you think this framework can or should be expanded to a broader scope, or are you a fan of keeping ethical frameworks more context specific?
Yeah, I mean, I think, listen, as I said, we started from the point of saying we know there's a ton of ethical questions in AI, tech, LLMs, and 8 million papers already now written on ethics and AI, right? And so we really tried to say what's unique about this population, and can we really draw that out? And I think what you saw at the end was we did that somewhat successfully, and many of the things that we generated were also the same things that apply in all other settings. So, I think when we think about things like surrogate consent and the applicability or actually lack of desire for things like that, that's probably very specific to this population. But I do think in general, many of the principles and certainly the approach. I mean, I think the idea, again, I think that the challenge with AI ethics is, you hear the same things over and over and over again, but it doesn't actually tell you what to do at the end of the day. And so I think a pragmatic approach of, these are the questions you have to ask yourself and answer. Like, you actually need to commit yourself to answering these questions before you do your work. I think that is certainly applicable in any of our fields.
Thank you, Benji. So I believe we're just about at time and we have a hard stop at 1:40. Before we part ways, I want to give a quick shout out to Marie Kluker, who is in the audience here. And I guess I'm outing her as the human geriatric care manager who aside from being the best in the business, was also game for going up against an LLM to see um directly how her own work compares and how this resource may be used. And I think we were all universally pleased to find that the big finding of the study, which is that in the end, the human and the LLM in sync are probably pointing us to an integrated way forward. Thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us this afternoon and listening. Rachel, I'll hand it back to you very quickly, but I believe we are on break now for a video.